Last time we spoke about the darkest days of the siege of the foreign legation quarters in Beijing. The Hanlin Academy was burnt down, taking with it irreplaceable books. The Fu Palace and the French legation were falling to pieces. Colonel Shiba and his men fought for weeks without changing their clothes or sleeping more than 3 to 4 hours. Countless friends and colleagues were dead or wounded. Funerals were becoming a daily event. Ammunition was running low, men were running low, medical supplies were running low, everything was running low. Then suddenly some messages began to trickle in, allegedly from Prince Ching. The ministers were weary to trust them, but gradually pushed Prince Ching to show the Qing's good faith by establishing a truce. It seemed the darkest hours were just before the dawn, as Prince Ching established a truce on July the 17th. And now all wondered, what was next? This episode is The Boxer Rebellion Part 5, The Battle for Tientsin. Welcome back to the Fall and Rise of China podcast. I'm your dutiful host, Craig Watson. But before we begin, I just want to remind you all that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Perhaps you want to learn a bit more about the history of Asia? Kings and Generals has an assortment of episodes on the history of Asia and so much more, so go give them a look over at YouTube. So please subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube and continue to help us produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And hey, don't forget about our sister podcast over at the Pacific War Week by Week podcast, written and narrated by me. And if after all of that you are still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel over at YouTube. Over there I have this rather crazy episode on the Ramri Island Massacre myth, where allegedly thousands of Japanese were eaten by saltwater crocodiles. But it's not really true. Also, you can check out my Patreon at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel if you want to hear some exclusive podcasts. There is a current vote for the next one, and it looks like a podcast on Tomoyuki Yamashita and how he became the Tiger of Malaya will be the winner. Check it out, it means a lot to me. The July 17th truce came at a perfect time. The defenders were exhausted. Food had become so scarce, they had been sending raiding parties into the Mongol market. But for most, the regular diet consisted of horse, pony, mule meat, and rice. And you know, as I say that, just a random note, I am born and raised in Quebec, and we eat horse meat here, typically for tartare. Not all the time, mind you, it's kind of a rare thing, but like nine times out of 10 at a grocery store, you will see horse meat there. And apparently this is pretty weird for everybody else in North America. I don't know. To be honest, horse meat is really dry, so certainly needs a lot of dressing up, but yeah. One thing that was easy to come by was champagne and wine. There was an enormous supply of it in the legation buildings. As Lennox Simpson put it, "Had it not been for the monopole, of which there are great stores in the hotel and club, 1,000 cases in all, I should have collapsed." There was an enormous concern for the Chinese Christians in the Fu Palace, who were constantly attacked and very isolated. Again, Lennox Simpson investigated this, and he had this to write about it. "The feeding of our native Christians, an army of nearly 2,000, is still progressing, but babies are dying rapidly, and nothing further can be done. There is only just so much rice, and the men who are doing the heavy coolie work on the fortifications must be fed better than the rest, or else no food at all would be needed. The native children, with hunger gnawing savagely at their stomachs, wander about stripping the trees of their leaves. They had terrible, water-swollen stomachs and pitiful sticks of legs. To the babies we give all the scraps of food we can gather up after our own rough food is eaten, and to see the little disappointed faces when there is nothing sadder than to watch the wounded being carried in. Thus enclosed in our brick-bound lines, each of us is spinning out his fate. The Europeans still have as much food as they need. The Chinese are half starving." The Christian Chinese laborers complained about working for the British legation, telling their supervisors, The work at the British legation is crushing, and they don't feed you enough. And if you do not carry out their orders to the letter, they flog you. Therefore, we don't want to go there. The Chinese Christian laborers preferred working for the non-Christian Japanese, and Colonel Shiba even raised a force of Christian Chinese volunteers as riflemen, who he trained personally. There were also incidents of Chinese Christian girls being sexually assaulted, particularly by Russian guards, whose barricades were close to the girls' lodgings. A written notice was erected forbidding anyone to approach the girls' lodgings, prompting a Russian commander named Baron von Hagen to, quote, take off his cap, and assuming a very polite air of doubt and perplexity, he inquired of the Lady Missionary Committee, which oversees the welfare of these girls. Pardon, mesdames, he said purposely in French. Cette affiche est seulement pour les civils ou aussi pour les militaires? Excuse me, ladies, does this apply only to civilians or also to the military? Sexual assault was not the only thing going on. Apparently, the British legation gardens saw people come together practically each night to make romance. Hey, when you think it's going to be your last day, right? Forces over the Daku forts were coming over to help lift the siege of Tientsin. Men of the United States 9th Infantry came over from the Philippines. Now that the situation looked more land-based than naval, Vice Admiral Seymour was sent back with his squadron on July the 11th, leaving Brigadier General Dorward in command of British forces. But there was no supreme Allied commander. There were tremendous delays as each nation's officers argued who should lead, and finally it was agreed the Qing-held part of Tientsin had to be taken before any talks of marching upon Beijing. A plan was formed to attack the Qing-held part of the city beginning on July 13th. They were widely outnumbered, around 6,900 to a Qing force of around 30,000, half of which were boxers. There were 2,500 Russians, 2,000 Japanese, 900 Americans, 800 British, and 600 French. They were going to be facing the formidable walls of Tientsin, which were 20 feet high and 16 feet thick. Within the city and nearby forts were around 12,000 Qing soldiers well armed with artillery, machine guns, and modern rifles. The French, Americans, British, and Japanese were to advance upon the south gate in 3 columns, while the Germans and Russians circled around to hit the east gate. The approach was a flat marshy plain, intersected by canals and lagoons. It was by no means ideal. Herbert Hoover knew the land quite well, and he volunteered to guide the forces and had this to write of his experience. We came under sharp fire from the Chinese located on its old walls. We were out in the open plains with little cover except Chinese graves. I was completely scared, especially when some of the Marines next to me were hit. I was unarmed. I could scarcely make my feet move forward. I asked the officer I was with for a rifle, and at once I experienced a curious psychological change, for I was no longer scared, although I had never fired a shot. I can recommend that men carry weapons when they go into battle. It's a great comfort. Hoover described how the attack was badly coordinated, riddled with miscommunication and very ill-tempered men. The main force was pinned down in front of the south gate, taking fire from the city walls. The Allied forces were huddled face down in mud, with the American troops standing out like sore thumbs wearing their dark blue uniforms. Yeah, if you have a chance, you can Google what the United States Marine uniform looked like in 1900. And there's actually some pictures of some of the battles for the Boxer Rebellion. They're quite extravagant uniforms. The Qing wielding Winchesters, Mannlicher, and Mausers were exacting terrible casualties upon them. Lieutenant Harry Rotherham of the Royal Welsh Fusiliers recalled, "The whole of the city wall was lined with Chinese firing through loopholes, and they just fired all day as hard as they could. They also attacked our left flank, and we were told off to keep them back. So we were under fire all day from the front and the left flank as well. I never want anything quite so warm again." Captain David Beatty noted the British forces took an entirely exposed position while the 9th U.S. Infantry were extremely exposed to Qing sharpshooters. Their commander, Colonel Emerson Liscombe, was fatally shot as he was trying to grab the regimental flags from a standard bearer who was falling. His dying words were, "Keep up the fire, men." Beatty led a company of British to rush over to help the Americans, and gradually they pulled back as it got dark. They had no news on how the Russians were doing with the East Gate. It was to be the Japanese who turned failure into success. General Fukushima Yasumasa had fought the Chinese during the First Sino-Japanese War. He sent word to some of the other commanders that Qing forces would fight to the death if they were trapped. But if you left an escape route, like two gates open, they would retreat. At 3 a.m., the Japanese blew up the South Gate in a scene I can only describe as that one where the Uruk-hai in the film Lord of the Rings, The Two Towers, comes in, with the torch, and then he blows up the part of the wall. The Japanese had been trying to light fuses to explode bombs, but the Qing kept stopping them, so one Japanese soldier ran with a short fuse to blow up the gate, and he was killed instantaneously by the explosion. He would have made Saruman proud. As told to us by Herbert Hirschinger of the U.S. Marines. The Japanese had been trying to accomplish it for some time, but the Chinese, he actually used a different word to name the Chinese that I'm not going to say, would cut the fuse. In the end, a Japanese officer volunteered to light a short fuse. The gate was blown in, but the officer went up with the gate. This only goes to show the metal of which the little fellows are made of. After the breach was made, the Japanese stormed into the city, followed by the 2nd Battalion, the Royal Welch Fusiliers, and Beatty's men. A bit later that morning, the Russians charged the East Gate on July the 9th, led by General Anatoly Steizl. General Nishichang personally led a counterattack to try and stop them. An Allied artillery shell exploded nearby him, showering him with shrapnel and fatally wounding him. As the Russians broke through the East Gate, prompting the Qing soldiers to withdraw from the city, French doctor Martineau was irritated to see that although the Japanese did the lion's share of work in the southern sector, the Union Jack was flying side by side with the rising sun over the South Gate. In his words, "Trois ou quatre soldats anglais, phlegmatiquement, fumant le pipe." 3 or 4 English soldiers, calmly smoking their pipes. Sounds to me like Merry and Pippin after Isengard fell. What is with all the Lord of the Ring references in this episode? Countless boxers and Qing soldiers slipped away, leaving little fighting over the city. The civilians bore the brunt of what became an orgy of looting and murder. A Chinese eyewitness had this to say: "People rushed about in all directions in dread of what was to come next. When someone shouted that the North Gate was open and that it was possible to leave by it, the whole city converged on the North Gate. In an instant, the press of the crowd was such that one couldn't move. The foreigners and Christians fired repeatedly on the crowd, each volley resulting in the deaths of several tens of people. The greater the numbers of people killed, the greater became the numbers of those fighting to escape. Dead from bullets, dead from artillery shells, dead from swords, dead from trampling. It was horrible. The corpses were piled several feet high. After 3 days of cleaning up following the foreigners' entry into the city, the streets were still not clean." The photographer James Rackleton stormed into the city with the troops, and he had this to record of what he saw. "A holocaust of human life, lines of homeless, weeping human beings, their homes in ashes, without food, friendless, and in many cases their kindred left charred in the ruins of their homes. Doors were smashed, shops were entered and plundered, men and women were fleeing, carrying their precious heirlooms, their jewels, their silks, their embroidery, their money. These much-prized valuables were snatched from them, and they dared not protest." American Marine Harold Kinman recalled this: "The streets wet and slippery were with blood." A British sailor described this: "Human brains strewn over the streets and dead Chinese pinned to the walls by Japanese swords and bayonets." Many of the accounts place atrocities upon the Russians and Japanese, but soldiers from each nation took part in the orgy, and there are many photographs for those with the stomachs to Google them. I think I said this once in this series, but the Boxer Rebellion in general is very well written about because, well, there was so many different nationalities present and everybody was writing about it at the time. It's one of these older, or I guess not so older, events that has so many primary sources associated with it. And for the photos, my God, there is a lot of photos of the event, and yeah, they are pretty hard to look at sometimes. On July the 15th, in an attempt to stop the looting, the British put up pickets and orders not to allow anyone to get past except for the French, whose authorities had not agreed to suppress looting. So the French have not changed since the Second Opium War. So as a result, many British just pretended to be French, apparently doing bad French singing impressions to get by and spoke terrible French phrases to another. Notably, British civilians took part in this as well, and they knew which houses and shops had the best goods. It was to be the bloodiest battle for the Eight-Nation Alliance during the Boxer Rebellion. 250 Allied soldiers had died, with 500 wounded. Of this, the Japanese paid the most, with 320 casualties, the Russians and Germans around 140, the Americans 25, dead, 98 wounded, the British 17 dead, 87 wounded, and the French 13 dead with 50 wounded. There was no official calculation of the losses for the Boxers and Qing forces, but it is to be expected it was very heavy. I think for you longtime listeners, you can see that there's a distinct difference now from, let's say, our Opium Wars days to the turn of the 20th century. Warfare had changed considerably. Casualties were much higher now, something that would be proved to a horrifying extent during the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 to 1905. Or as many people today like to call it, World War Zero. Tientsin was now being secured as a launching point for a future advance upon Beijing. Back over in Beijing, the foreign community found it surreal after the July 17th truce was announced. The sudden silence of guns was more disconcerting than comforting. Some even found it difficult to sleep. The Qing banners were brought down and white flags were hoisted all around in their place. Countless Qing soldiers began peering over the walls and barricades to look at the legations. Likewise, the defenders looked out into the desolate landscape around them. Corpses were everywhere. Dogs were picking at them. As everyone's confidence built up, some Qing soldiers went over to the defenders' positions and began fraternizing with the foreigners. Many began to talk to the foreigners, giving them news that the Daku forts in Tientsin had fallen to the allied nations, and that General Dong Fuxiang's Gansu army and many Boxers were now performing offensives between Tientsin and Beijing. Many of the Qing troops who came forward explained they did not want to be part of the siege, but were being kind of coerced into it. The foreigners were beginning to suspect the truce had been made because of the Qing losses at the Daku forts in Tientsin. Perhaps a relief force was already on the way. Within the Qing court, the loss at Tansin had proved the progressives and moderates right, that joining the Boxers was a doomed cause. This was a view shared by most of the governors and viceroys in the southern and eastern provinces, who were actively holding their troops back, not daring to attack foreigners. Going back to early June when edicts were being made declaring war, most of the viceroys and governors ignored it, and they refused to send troops. In fact, the foreign community had no idea, but their most valuable allies were amongst the Qing High Command. The Manchu general Ronglu, whom Empress Dowager Cixi appointed as imperial commissioner in command of the Wuwei Corps, consisting of the 5 most modern armies led by Ni Shicheng, Dong Fuxiang, Song Qing, Yuan Shukai, and Ronglu himself, were actually helping the foreigners. Well, most of them, certainly not Dong Fuxiang, who was trying to kill the foreigners as much as he could. When the Boxer Rebellion broke out, Prince Duan was pressuring Dong Fuxiang and his Gansu army to seize the foreign legations. But it was Ronglu who, behind the scenes, was sandbagging the entire situation. At first he tried to countermand orders to Dong Fuxiang, trying to stop him from attacking the foreign legations. But that gradually failed when Prince Duan began ordering anyone hampering the war effort to be arrested or killed. Then when Dong Fusang requested artillery to breach the legation defenses, Ronglu began blocking the transfer of artillery pieces and constantly made up excuses for why it was happening. Ronglu and Prince Ching coordinated efforts to sneak some food into the legations, and even used their most loyal Manchu bannermen to perform minor attacks on the Gansu army and the Boxers who were besieging the foreigners. Ronglu also withheld orders that were to be sent to General Ni Shicheng in Tientsin, telling him they were at war with the foreigners. So for the majority of the time, Ni Shicheng had thousands of men still fighting the Boxers. When Seymour ran into Ni Shicheng and they simply waved at each other and he moved on, that was because of Ronglu's orders to Ni Shicheng. Ronglu even tossed blame for inaction all upon Ni Shicheng, who, luckily for Ronglu, ended up dying before he could explain what had occurred to him. During the siege of the legations, the major reason so many riflemen were aiming so high was because Ronglu was countermanding orders. As Dong Fusang would order the men to kill all foreigners, Ronglu continuously ordered the men to just make it seem like they were helping the siege, but not to kill the foreigners. So one could argue the MVP of the Eight-Nation Alliance was Qing generals like Ronglu or Prince Ching. The foreigners knew none of this, but they would receive enormous intelligence on July the 18th from one of Colonel Shiba's messengers who went over to Tientsin, and he returned confirming it was in Allied hands. The messenger also told them a force of 11,000 British, Russian, Japanese, American, and French would begin a march upon Beijing, starting on the 20th. MacDonald then invited a nearby Gansu officer to parley with them, and the man reluctantly acquiesced. The man shared cigars and spoke using an interpreter. The officer asked MacDonald who the men wearing the big funny hats were. MacDonald explained that they were American Marines. The officer shrugged and stated his men were afraid of them because they were pretty good shots. The officer then explained his superior was not Dong Fusang, but General Ronglu, who had the overall command. He also stated Ronglu wished to stop the fighting. MacDonald was puzzled by this, and he explained the fighting was never started by the foreigners. The officer was puzzled by that statement and said perhaps he should write to Ronglu to explain his views. Both men shook hands and departed. MacDonald, before departing the wall, took one last look at the scenery and described the situation. I could see the enemy's position stretching away to the north until they disappeared in the direction of the imperial city. There were barricades in the streets below the wall. A large temple was loopholed and full of men. More men were amongst the ruins west of the Russian legation, and a series of mounds which commanded this legation in the Mongol market was gay with the uniforms of hundreds of imperial infantry. Following the line west of the Mongol market, the tops of the houses carried nests of these bright-coated soldiery. Altogether, from my position, I saw some 1,500 to 2,000 men, and many more must have been hidden behind the walls and ruined houses. MacDonald wrote to Ronglu proposing rules of conduct going forward. He promised the foreigner forces would only fire if being attacked upon, except in the case of seeing Qing forces building barricades closer to them. Any unarmed persons who approached the legation defenses could do so safely, but only 2 men at a time. MacDonald gave the letter to the officer he had talked to, who delivered it to Ronglu. The very next day, Ronglu sent a man carrying a flag of truce who came over to officially accept the proposals. However, there was a catch. The man explained this would be on behalf of the forces loyal to Ronglu and Prince Ching. They were commanding the south and eastern portions of the siege, but Dong Fusang's troops held the north and the west. In fact, the officials explained the officer whom MacDonald had spoken to was one of the very few Gansu troops who was willing to follow commands from Ronglu. Dong Fusang was quite the renegade. It became clear after a few days the word truce was a bit of a misnomer. It was more of a half-armistice. Some Qing were still mining close to Hanlin, and various barricade forces continued to fire upon the legations. Some Qing soldiers east of the Fu Palace began using a dog to send communications to the Japanese, as noted by their officers. One day a large dog trotted into the Japanese barricade, with a note tied around its neck. This was from the Chinese general commanding in that quarter, pointing out the futility of further defense and recommending unconditional surrender. A reply declining the suggestion in somewhat forcible terms was tied to the dog's neck, with which it trotted back. This was repeated several times. The dog seemed to enjoy the fun, the advisability of surrender being urged with greater insistence each time. The answers varied only in strength of their language. Some Qing soldiers began offering fruit, vegetables, and chickens to the foreigners, bargaining for money. The Japanese were even able to barter for rifles and ammunition from some Qing soldiers, believe it or not. The Zhonglianmen began sending gifts of fruits, vegetables, even ice to the besieged, all in the name of Emperor Guangxu. Many worried the food was poisoned, so they first gave it to a dog, which is just mean. A constant stream of letters began to go back and forth between the foreigners, Prince Ching, and other moderate Qing officials. The recurring theme on behalf of the Qing was that the foreigners needed to depart Beijing, and that the Zhonglianmen would provide protection all the way to Tientsin. This was constantly ignored. The Qing government also began mediating on behalf of the ministers of their governments, ferrying messages back and forth. On July the 28th, the foreigners received word from the Shandong youth who had been sent out to Tientsin. He sent a letter back stating this: "Your letter for July. There are now 24,000 troops landed and 19,000 here. General Gasly expected Daku tomorrow. Russian troops are at Beijing. Tientsin city is under foreign government and Boxer power here is exploded. There are plenty of troops on the way if you can keep yourselves in food. Almost all ladies have left Tientsin." On August the 1st, another letter arrived dated from July the 26th, addressed to Japanese Minister Baron Nishi. It officially stated troops were on their way, but they were delayed because of the railway damage, but that their vanguard should arrive 2 or 3 days later. The foreigners checked their food stores, noting that they had 600 pounds of white rice, 11,500 pounds of yellow rice, 34,000 pounds of wheat all left. They estimated it would last them 5 more weeks of siege, alongside the 30 ponies they had left. My God, those poor ponies. Nigel Oliphant also noted, "Cigars and tobacco are running out, which is more serious to some of us than want of food." The condition of the Chinese Christians at the Food Palace was horrible, as written in the diary of Lennox Simpson on July the 24th. "The miserable natives imprisoned by our warfare are in a terrible state of starvation. Their bones are cracking through their skin. Their eyes have an insane look. Yet nothing is being done for them. They are afraid to attempt escape even in this quiet, as the water gate is watched on the outside night and day by Chinese sharpshooters, tortured by the sight of these starving wretches who moan and mutter night and day. The posts nearby shoot down dogs and crows and drag them there. They say everything is devoured raw with cannibal-like cries." I should note, while you hear sympathies from some accounts by the foreigners in regards to the Chinese Christians, by no means were they distributing out food equally amongst them. As you can only imagine with the 19th century attitudes, the Chinese were treated like subhumans. After a few days, it seemed the half-armistice was fading away. The Qing were constructing a large barricade across the North Bridge, which the foreigners began to use the international gun against. Qing sharpshooters took up positions to thwart the men using the international gun. The barricade reached 6 feet high over the length of the bridge. The foreigners reacted by building their own barricade over the South Bridge, securing communications between the British and the other legations. All the while, the Zhonglianmen was sending reassurances and advising the foreign community to take their offer to depart under their protection. By August the 4th, there was still no sign of a relief force, and the truce was certainly all but over, as artillery was pounding the legations heavily. Back on July the 26th, the former governor of Shandong, Li Bingheng, had come to Beijing and began pressuring the Boxers and the Qing to ramp up the siege efforts. Empress Dowager Cixi favored Li Bingheng and gave him the rare honor of riding within the Forbidden City before receiving the promotion to deputy commander of the northern armies. 2 days after he showed up, 2 moderate Qing officials were executed as traitors for criticizing the Boxers and advocating for lifting the siege. 3 other moderate officials would follow days later in what was becoming a purge within the court. More Boxers began to flood Beijing, cowing the surviving moderates into submission. A very nervous Prince Ching wrote to some southern viceroys and governors who all agreed the Boxers needed to be suppressed, but Prince Ching did not dare publicly give the order. When Vice Admiral Seymour was rescued from his rescue attempt, he sent word to the British Admiralty that at least 40,000 troops would be needed to lift the siege at Beijing. Other nations, such as America, thought it should be 80,000. Japan estimated 70,000. But the logistics of mounting an international rescue force became difficult and quite quickly. Not all the great powers involved could afford to muster troops at this time. Hell, America was fighting a war in the Philippines. Britain was fighting the Boer War. The French were fighting in Indochina, and the Russians had a full-on war going on in Manchuria that I am planning to tackle on later. Japan was one of the few nations free and quite able to send a large force. So the other nations appealed to Japan, who agreed to send an additional 20,000 men to Tientsin. Then there was the issue of a supreme allied commander. Kaiser Wilhelm, as usual, sought to grab the reins for Germany, and he used von Ketteler's murder as justification. Kaiser Wilhelm nominated Field Marshal Count von Waldersee, whom would go on to say of the appointment, "A Japanese supreme command, no less than an American, was out of the question from the start. The French had not made any effort to get the supreme command, leaving only Russia and Britain as Germany's rivals. But neither would concede it to the other, and moreover, no one favored England, as the reputation of the English generalship had suffered a setback in the Boer War." The Kaiser persuaded Russia and Japan to back his nominee, and everyone abided by the decision. Von Waldersee was set to depart for China on August 18th. But meanwhile, in Berlin, the Kaiser gave a speech, tossing away the prepared text for his own words. "You must know, my men, that you are about to meet a crafty, well-armed foe. Meet him and beat him. Give no quarter. Take no prisoners. Kill him when he falls into your hands, even as 1,000 years ago the Huns under their king Attila made such a name for themselves as still resounds in terror through legend and fable. So may the name of Germany resound through Chinese history, that never again will a Chinese dare to so much as look askance at a German." Ironically, a lot of his talk about the Huns and Attila would be used as propaganda against Germany in World War I. By the end of July, 25,000 men were at Daku and Tientsin, with a lot more on the way. Britain was calling up forces from India, America from the Philippines. Tientsin was swimming with foreign troops, so much so doctors began vaccinating their men against smallpox. Tensions were mounting, as most of these nations were in proxy wars with another. The Russians and Japanese particularly did not like another. Then on July the 27th, a quite cheeky maneuver was pulled. The British Commander-in-Chief, General Gasely, began to argue there was a need for quick action. He was met by resistance from the French and the Russians, who cautioned delay, but Gasely argued, "The rainy season will set in a few days, and the whole place will be underwater." Gasely determined to take control of the situation suddenly, so he told the other leaders that Britain would go it alone if necessary. The Americans backed him up, thus forcing the hand of the others. For none of the other great powers wanted to see Britain and America steal the glory. It was agreed they would all march on August the 5th as an international relief force, and they would be quite a sight to behold, as told to us by the United States Marine officer Smedley Butler. French Zouaves in red and blue, blonde Germans in pointy helmets, Italian bersaglieri with tossing plumes, Bengal cavalry on Arabian stallions, turbaned Sikhs, Japanese, Russians, English. We are going to fight the greatest battle at Peking that has ever been fought for 100 years. I would like to take this time to remind all of you that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Please go subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube and continue to help us produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And hey, don't forget our sister podcast over at the Pacific War Week by Week podcast, written and narrated by me. And if after all that you are still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel over at YouTube. If you want to do me a solid favor, could you please go check out my fairly new episode on the Ramri Island Massacre myth. You can even see me do an embarrassing skit from the famous film Jaws. Also, please check out my Patreon account at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel for more exclusive podcasts. A vote was just made, and it seems the next one will be about Tomoyuki Yamashita and how he became the Tiger of Malaya. The Qing were at war with 8 different great powers, and even amongst themselves in many ways. The Daku forts had fallen, Tientsin had fallen, and now the 8-nation alliance was going to march upon Beijing. By all means, it was time to toss in the towel, wasn't it?